Hi, welcome to tutorial number 4, having fun with the physics engine in Unity. And yes, I did say fun and physics in the same sentence, because playing around with the physics engine in Unity can be fun if you understand all the components and how they work. So today I'm going to be adding on to what we did in tutorial number 3 by taking some of our objects, adding box colliders to them, turning on gravity, adding some basic physics materials, and seeing how they all interact. Now, the one thing you need to remember is that the physics engine and the rendering engine in Unity are two separate components. They run at the same time, but the rendering engine tends to run at about 30 frames a second, and the physics engine runs at about 100 frames a second. Now, the physics engine is going to control how our objects interact with each other and their environment according to the basic rules of physics. That means momentum, friction, gravity, things like that. The rendering engine doesn't care anything about these things. So really, that's why they're really two separate components. So, before I talk on too much longer, let's put on our programming glasses and let's get to work. All right, now if you watch tutorial number 3, you'll remember that we had set up our blue grid. We had set up a blaster that we moved back and forth, and it was launching these basic arrow objects. So what we're going to do is we are going to be adding a little physics and colliders to some of these objects. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get rid of these numbers here. It was helpful when we were just introducing our coordinate system. And a handy way to do that is, if you'll notice this little checkbox up here in the inspector, if I just uncheck that, it's going to disable those that empty object and any objects underneath it. So if I want to bring them back for some reason, I can. So that is something we can do just to make them go away for the time being. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm going to make myself a different projectile. I don't want to use that big arrow. The arrow was nice when talking about bringing in meshes and seeing the orientation, but it's a bit big for what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new 3D object. Just going to make a basic cube here. And I'm going to scale it in the Z direction to make it a little longer. All right. I'm going to drag it back over to my meshes to make it a prefab. Can delete this over here. I'm going to select this. Let's rename it. Hit F2. Rename it to missile. All right. So you'll notice that when I made this, it created by default this box collider. And the box collider is going to let us interact with other objects in the physics system. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in on our object here. And what we can do is, if I select this icon here, I can actually see and edit the box collider. By default, for a cube, it makes it the exact same size and shape as my mesh. But if I grab one of these little guys here, I can actually make it bigger or smaller. And this is what the physics engine sees. It doesn't care about this mesh, the visible part. All it cares about is this box collider. Now, usually you want your box collider to be as close around your object as possible, but sometimes you may want it a little bigger and sometimes you may want it a little smaller. We can Control Z to undo that. And we can delete that missile again. All right, so we have a missile, has a box collider. It doesn't make a rigid body, and remember, we need a rigid body also in order to give our object mass. Remember, the heavier the object is, the more momentum it'll have once it gets moving. It'll also, if I apply a force to it, it will take more force to get it moving. And basically, it will make the object heavier. Mass is that. And 1 is just the default value. I'm not sure what it represents other than just a number. I don't think it represents kilograms or pounds or anything like that. But it's all relative. So we'll start out and we'll just leave it with a mass of 1, and it has its box collider. So what we're going to do is we are going to select our controller, and instead of using our arrow, I'm going to use our missile. So now we have our blaster, and it's going to launch our missile. The other thing we forgot to do is we need to attach our script, our missile controller script, or projectile handler, to make sure that our projectile is going to delete itself once it passes off the grid. All right, I had my game window off to the other screen, so we'll drag it back on. We'll run, and we'll see what happens. So, first thing you'll notice is it launched something, but then it disappeared. And where'd it go? If we click here, we can see it is dropping very rapidly. Why is it doing that? Let's drag this out of the way again. We can stop running. So now let's look at our missile. Well, our missile says use gravity. So gravity is going to pull our projectile down unless it runs into something. So it needs to run into something, and the fact is that it wasn't running into anything, so it just dropped. So what does it need to run into? Well, the plane, let's select on the plane. We can see it has a mesh collider. So by default, it created a collider that covered the entire mesh. So why did it not work if we had a box collider and a mesh collider? Well, let's look at our controller, and what happened is it instantiated. If you remember from our previous tutorial, every time I click my mouse button down, we are creating or instantiating our projectile. And what I have here is I added this line of code just for demonstration purposes. It sets the Y value here to 0. And what happened is the projectile appeared right in the middle of our plane, meaning the bottom of the collider was already below our plane. And so it couldn't collide with the plane. They actually were intersecting, which technically should never happen in a collider because they should bounce off each other. But in this case, I forced it to, and it kind of sunk right through the plane and dropped out of sight. So let's get rid of this. So what's going to happen is it's creating the position at the exact position of our blaster component. And the blaster component's height is actually at 1, which is tall enough for our missile. All right, now let's try to run that one. So I will drag out our game window again. We will hit play. And click. Well, it didn't sync this time, but it's not really going anywhere, is it? No, it is not. So, why is it not moving? Well, basically we got friction here. There's friction between our missile and our plane. And really we don't want friction. We want to glide over the plane. So there's a couple things we could do. We could just turn off gravity and just have it kind of float above the plane. But we're going to leave gravity on, and we're going to do something. We're going to add a physics material. Well, notice right now it shows no physics material, and I assume it uses some default physics material. But what we want to do is create a new physics material that basically gets rid of all of our friction. So we're going to come up to our materials, right click, create, and we scroll down, we click on physics material. So you'll see by default our physics material has a friction. Static friction means the friction in order to make a element that's not moving initially move. So you can imagine trying to get your car started to roll or get a big box starting to push across a floor. It takes some amount to get it moving, and we're going to make that 0. Dynamic friction is the amount of friction, I believe, that while it's moving, it still has some drag. So we are going to rename this frictionless material. All right. So now let's select our missile, and we are going to grab our frictionless material, and we are going to drag it onto the physics material. We also want our plane to be frictionless, and so we're going to grab our same frictionless material and grab it and drag it onto there. Let's move this guy back on, if he'll cooperate. Here we go. And let's go. All right, there we go. Our missiles are gliding along very well on our plane, exactly as we wanted them to. So we have successfully created a box collider, and it is gliding along on top of our plane exactly how we want it to. So now we want to see how it's going to interact with some other objects. So what we're going to do is we are going to add some boxes here. So we're going to come over here, and we are going to create a cube. You'll notice it has a box collider. You're going to add a component to it. Physics, rigid body. We'll give it a mass. We'll give it a lighter mass. Let's give it like 0.25. So our missile is going to be 4 times heavier than our box. And we'll see what that does in a minute. So let's just select our box, and let's see what happens when we run with our box. We can see it drops down and glides and sits right on top of our plane, exactly how it should. And you'll see it's at y.5. So what we're going to do is we are going to give it y component of 0.5, an easy way of seeing exactly what the height should be if it's sitting on top of our plane. Let's zoom in a bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that box, Control D. Oops, just like that. I always like in Blender, Shift D is duplicate, and in Unity, Control D is duplicate. Just make it a little harder on us. All right, so we're going to make a stack of boxes here. Grab all these guys, move them down a bit. Doesn't matter, they don't need to sit right on top of each other, because as soon as gravity kicks in, they'll all settle down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these cubes. Let's duplicate them again. Move them over here. Duplicate them again. Move them over here just for fun. All right, so we got some stacks of boxes here. So we're going to do now run our game again. So now we have some boxes off in the distance here. So I'm going to run. What I'm going to do is I'm going to launch my missile, see what happens. So you can see the missile plowed right through that box, and kept on sliding, and it kind of changed the trajectory of the missile. So if we launch it again, we can see it's going to go crashing through those cubes. Knocking them down, the cubes kind of roll around. Let's knock down that last one. Oh, there we go. See, it is kind of fun playing around with this stuff. At least I'm having fun. And if you're not having fun doing some of this, maybe you shouldn't be making games, because the fact is figuring a lot of this stuff out, and when we get into some of the more complicated things, can be very frustrating, and it can take a lot of trial and error to figure this stuff out. A lot of Googling around, watching videos like this. And unless you're having fun and seeing the result, then, it takes a lot to get through this. And figuring this stuff out just to do these videos, I got to play around with this stuff, do a little bit of trial and error to make sure that I know what I'm doing. And none of it comes super easy. So I always have fun just seeing the results and playing around with the physics engine and seeing things fall down and roll around is kind of fun. So let's stop this. So you'll notice that there's been some things going through the log here. And the last thing I'm going to do, cover on this video, is how to react to a collision in your script. So what we're going to do is we are going to come back to our script. And in our projectile handler, what I have is I've added this function right here. And what that is on collision enter. And on collision enter is going to be triggered anytime that whatever object script is attached to, which is our projectile, anytime it collides with something, this on collision enter is going to be called. And what it's going to do is it's going to pass in this collision class. And that collision class essentially has an instance of the object that I collided with. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write to our debug log, and I'm going to take the collision and I'm going to take its transform, because again, it is an object, and I'm going to grab the name. Basically, what this is going to do is it's going to get me the name of the object that it collided with. So if we come back here, if I select this cube right now is named cube. So I'm going to call it my collision cube. So remember, my collision cube is on the left. Let's drag this object back on here. Let's run. Let's try to line up with that left-hand side, and let's watch our item here. So initially it fell and it collided with the plane when it started sliding, so that's why plane showed up. Is gonna misbehave here because I'm a little bit off to the left. All right. Whoop, we actually missed the one cube we wanted to hit. Not sure if it scrolled by, but you can see what it's doing is it's printing the name of all of the objects that it collided with. Oop, there's my collision cube. So in this way, if you want to identify or somehow tag, there's lots of ways to identify an object. One way is the name, so you can tell basically who you're colliding with. All right, so what we've done on this video is we have introduced our box colliders, talked a little bit about mass and momentum. We created our frictionless material, and we showed in the code how to detect a collision and react to it. So this ends this video just really covering the basics of physics. What we're going to do following this is take all the things we've learned and actually put it together into a little game. These videos up to this point have just kind of covered the real basics of all the components, and I now have all the components I need in order to put a very rudimentary game together. So stay tuned for tutorial number 5, where we will start our spaceship blaster game.